Hey everyone, so this is going to be the first of a kind of video series called Cooking with Mr. Tolley or My Neighbor's Table. I'm going to do it over the summer so that if you want to, you can cook with me, and we're going to cook through that Cultural Night Cookbook. So this first one is going to be the naan bread recipe, which is towards the back of the cookbook. This was submitted by Miss Shaw, and it is an example of a type of flatbread that comes from India. So flatbreads mean that they have a leavening agent in them, so they're not tortillas, but they don't rise as much as a normal bread does. You raise them just a little tiny bit, just enough to kind of get up. And then you cook them typically on a griddle. So instead of baking them, which actually contributes to the rise, when you bake bread, you actually cause it to rise even higher. Instead of doing that, what you end up doing is you end up getting just a little bit of rise by cooking on a flat top grill or in a pan or something like that. Naan bread happens to be one of the typical breads of India. It's often served with butter on top. Typically it's served with butter on top, a butter called ghee. Ghee, which is a clarified butter, meaning they cook out all the proteins, all the milk proteins out of it. And sometimes it's served with garlic, sometimes not, but it's always served alongside the meal as something to kind of sop up the soup. So a lot of Indian food uses stews and soups and things like that, curries. Another type of flatbread that came out of India and actually traveled a long ways around the world is a type of bread called roti, R-O-T-I. So we are going to look at flatbread, specifically naan, which is the recipe that Miss Shaw gave us. We're going to look at kind of how to make that. So join in, cook with me, and then send me pictures of what you finished. And so I've got most of my ingredients ready and to go, so I'm going to kind of work through this a little bit at a time. So we're going to start with, according to the recipe, a half cup of water. Make sure the water is nice and warm. We're going to be using this to activate our yeast in a second. To that, I would like to add exactly 1 teaspoon of sugar and my yeast. Now, yeast is actually a living organism. It is a strain of something that grows and populates. So what we're doing with this is we are waking up our yeast. So we're going to sprinkle our yeast on top of our water, which is really a type of sugar water at this point. And the yeast is going to start eating it. It's going to eat all of that delicious sugar water, and it's going to wake up, and it's going to kind of get a little bit bigger and a little bit going. So we're going to let that go for about 5 minutes. All right, so as you can see, our yeast has woken up. You can see that it's all nice and bubbly and frothy. If your yeast doesn't do this, it means that your yeast is expired and has gone bad. So what you need to do is you just need to get more, but it should always come back like this. So now we're gonna add our next set of ingredients. We're gonna put in a 1/4 cup of yogurt. Now, yogurt has a special effect on bread. It takes all these things called glutens, which are these protein molecules inside of flour, and it loosens them up, and it makes your bread very, very tender. So this is a neat trick that you can use if you want a very soft, very tender bread. We are gonna add an egg. Trick on an egg, crack it ahead of time. Crack your egg before you put it in. That way, if you get any shells in your egg, it doesn't get into your food. We are also going to add in some olive oil. Now, this does not say this in this recipe, but I'm going to do this anyways. I'm going to mix this a little bit now. So I have all these wet ingredients here, and I want these wet ingredients to play nicely with my dry ingredients. So if I give them a nice little mix now, they'll be all ready when I start adding in different ingredients. So we are going to add next 2 cups of flour. Now, the reason we're starting with less flour than the recipe actually says is we're just kind of getting started. We don't know how much flour we need overall, so we're going to add in these 2 cups of flour first. And once the flour is in, we're going to add in the salt. Salt and yeast do not get along very well with each other. Salt can actually kill the yeast, so we want to add the salt in later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix this together. There you can see we have a nice little dough starting to form. Now it is still very wet. Now the reason this recipe says 2.5 to 3 cups of flour is because flour has different hydration levels at different times of year, different weather. If it's really wet outside, it absorbs water less. If it's really dry outside, it absorbs water more, depending on the flour you get. So it's really worth taking the time to kind of go step by step. So I'm going to be adding a little bit more flour into this to make into this soft dough. So I'm going to start with just a half cup of flour. Now, one thing to know is when you're mixing flour, if you need to be very precise, I'm not being super precise right now, so I'm not worrying about too much. Don't scoop flour directly out of a container because it gets compacted down. You actually end up with more flour than you want. It's always best to use a different container to kind of transfer your flour around. So now I've got my dough kind of started and I'm going to knead. The kneading process allows me to get all that extra water to play in with all that extra flour, and it'll get it to this kind of silky smooth structure. So when we knead flour, we have a little bit of, or knead bread, we have a little bit of flour on our counter, and we're going to be pressing down and kind of folding. And we're going to do this until we get a nice silky texture. So if you look now, it's kind of pulling apart. It's a little bit crusty. We want it to be nice and silky. I'm going to go ahead and knead this flour. All right, so while I'm kneading, what I'm doing is you'll see that my flour levels on my table get less and less, and I might even add a little more in a little bit. And the reason that's happening is I'm literally absorbing the flour up into the bread as I knead it. So you have to be careful when you're kneading. So if you start with a dough that's exactly how you want it to be, you want to put very little flour down. I like to knead to get my extra flour in because I have to do it anyways, so might as well. If you are lucky enough to have a stand mixer at home, you can attach something called a dough hook to a stand mixer, and you can let that do all your kneading for you. Add a little more flour if you want to. It's kind of lazy, but it does make life a little bit easier for you. All right, and there we got it. If you look, you can see my bread is not pulling apart. It's not crumbling as much as it was. It's got a little stretch to it. It is a nice silky texture. So I'm gonna let this sit, and we're gonna let it sit for a couple of reasons. We are gonna let it sit because it needs to rise a little bit more. So we're gonna let it sit aside for an hour, and during that time, that yeast is going to eat a bunch of those sugars and starches in the flour, and it's going to let off a bunch of gas, carbon dioxide gas, which is gonna make my bread go and puff up. That's why there's little bubbles and holes inside of your bread. But I also need to let the gluten rest because right now it's all tight and tense, and if I tried to roll out to this right now, it would go whoop and then shrink right back again. So I'm gonna set this aside for about an hour, and in an hour I will be making bread. So see you then. All right, so it's been about an hour and the dough has doubled in size. So I'm going to be rolling it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of flour and just dust my area. I don't want a lot because I've already got a lot of flour in there. I don't want to add too much more. Now I'm going to place my dough out on the surface. I'm going to be cutting this into 8 equal pieces. So the easiest way to do that is simply to cut it as it is. So I'm going to cut it in half vertically, and then I'm going to cut it in half horizontally, and then I'm going to cut it in half diagonally, and I'm going to make 8 equal sizes. So as you saw, I cut it into half, which gave me 2 pieces. I cut those 2 pieces in half again, which gave me 4, and then I cut each of those 4 pieces in half, which gave me 8. So I'm going to move this out of my way because I need a good space. I'm going to take one of those little wedges of dough and I'm going to kind of make it into a ball. And then I'm going to flatten it just a little bit with my hand. I'm going to get some flour on it, and then I'm going to roll it out. Now, there are lots of types of rolling pins. My rolling pin happens to be French style, so it has no edges to it. I happen to like this one. I use it when I make crepes a lot. Now, to get a nice good circle, I'm going to roll outward, I'm going to turn, I'm going to roll outward, I'm going to turn, I'm going to roll outward, and I'm going to turn. Now, you'll notice as I roll it out,
not crepes.
That's right. My wife just, I don't know if you guys heard her off thing. I met croissants. I like to use this one to make croissants because I can get a big roll.
Don't confuse people with rolling out crepes.
You never roll out a crepe. She's right. So as you guys can see, I'm just going to kind of rough it out to about 6 inches in size. And then I'm going to set it off to the side. And I'm going to do my other ones. I'm going to just do those real quick. All right, so as you can see, I'm adding a little bit more flour in between each time I roll. Making sure I get it right. And I'm not worrying too much about these being perfectly sized. I don't actually care if mine are perfectly sized, and most people don't. There are a couple different naan shapes. Circular is definitely one of them. There's also the oval. Naan itself is a flatbread that comes from India. Although you can find versions of something like this around almost the entirety of kind of the Middle East over into Eastern Africa and all the way over into India and Pakistan. In the Middle East, it's often called pita bread. They're made a little differently, but they have very similar basis, which is this flatbread kind of shape. All right, so the recipe said to use a nonstick skillet, and there are a lot of good reasons to use nonstick skillets. I happen to be a fan of my old cast iron though. So I'm going to put them in there with a little bit of oil, and I'm just gonna let them cook. And as they cook, if you watch, you'll start to see them bubbling. So if you look right here, you can see the bubbles starting to form. That happens as water within the bread dough starts to steam, and it creates these little bubbles because it has to have somewhere to go. Now, naan bread is typically eaten with something like a stew used to sop up all of that. We happen to be having ours with a curry. This is a goat curry. Yes, I did say goat. We happen to love goat in this household, and I have all kinds of reasons why if you'd like to ask me on a different episode. But this is a Thai-style goat curry, which we were having with a Indian-style naan bread. So we're kind of mixing cultures here. But you can see these bubbles are starting to get really big, and I'll know that this is ready when these bubbles have gotten large and it's golden brown, and not cooking very hot at this point because I don't want to burn it before it cooks. So I keep it a little bit lower on temperature. The reason I like cast iron when I cook all of these is because cast iron has a great ability to maintain heat, so that even after it has turned off, it'll keep going. So while that's cooking, one good thing to do is to have a nice warm place ready for your naan bread. I already made one of these a little bit earlier, and you can see kind of what they're supposed to look like. Nice and golden brown around the edges. You can see those bubbles there, cooked on the other side. And that is how you make naan bread. At this point, you could add the butter if you wanted to. We're not going to do that because of health reasons, things like that. And then serve it with your favorite food, or just eat it like bread. That's what my daughter does. She just goes up and grabs hunks of naan bread and just eats it for a whole meal. All right, that was great, guys. Send me your pictures of your naan bread. I want to see how you did. And then next week, we are going to make eggs, and my daughter is going to cook those for you. Bye.